The storm came early that year, and louder than any warning it brought was the laughter that came before it. It began in the late fall, when the wind still tasted of dry grass, and every cabin wall was thin enough to hear your neighbor curse. And in those hills, 3 ridges east of Broken Toe Creek, just beyond the cut where the cottonwoods bent low, lived a woman named Clara Dorsey, with 2 children and no man. Her husband had died the year before, bucked from a mule and buried with less prayer than the mule that kicked him. What she did next would hang on every tongue in the valley, ridiculed, whispered, mocked, until the freeze came, and every cabin but hers was turned to brittle matchsticks in the wind. But nobody knew that yet. They just saw her hauling stones from the creek bed like a lunatic, not to build a hearth, but to dig a hole, and not just any hole, a deep black wound into the ground beside her cabin, then framed with logs stolen from her own barn. She wasn't insulating walls. She wasn't patching the gaps under the eaves. She was burying something, folks said. Some guessed it was madness. Some whispered it was the last of her husband's whiskey, hidden from the world. A few cruel tongues even said she was preparing her own grave, and her children's with it. But Clara never explained herself, because Clara didn't need them to understand. She only needed her children to survive. The digging began in late October. The ground was still dry enough to cut, and she worked with a pickaxe, sweating through every stroke like the reaper was behind her. 8 feet deep by 6 wide, she carved it like a grave. From a distance, it looked like madness. From up close, it smelled like purpose. She lined the bottom with rock, dragged in from the riverbed, then sealed the corners with packed clay. She built a narrow, stooping stair, more like a slope, that dropped into it from one end. Over the top, she laid thick crossbeams, not pine, but hardwood she'd salvaged from an abandoned mill cart miles down the ridge. Then came the mud. Every child in the valley remembered it, how she and her 2 little ones coated the log roof with layer after layer of sticky red dirt, hay mixed in, like making a frontier cake from misery. The roof grew heavier, thicker. By the time it cured in the sun, it looked like part of the earth itself, a wart on the hillside, barely visible from 30 feet off. And that was the point. This wasn't a cabin, this was something else, and they called it crazy. "What's that old witch doing now?" old Roger Bain muttered, teeth missing and pipe smoking by his fence post. He wasn't the only one watching. Whole families paused their chores to watch the widow with the red apron march stones like a mule team up and down the slope, her children trailing like dust shadows behind her. "Building a tomb," someone said. "Digging to China," another joked. "She's lost her mind since Dale passed," said a woman with a baby on her hip. The whispers stung, but Clara never slowed. If anything, she worked harder. She didn't glance up when folks passed. She didn't even speak much to her kids, just handed them baskets, clay, moss. They lined the inside walls of the pit like a beaver dam, stuffing every crack with packed sludge and bark peelings. At night, they slept on the cabin floor, too tired to cry, though sometimes the little one, June, would mumble something in her sleep about going under, and Clara would lay a hand on her chest and whisper, "Soon, we'll be safe down there soon." Safe, that was all she wanted. Not warm, not comfortable, safe. The storm she feared wasn't rumor, it was memory. 7 years before, in the high plains outside Wichita, Clara had watched a blue norther eat a dozen homes in one night. She'd seen a baby's lips turn black from cold before dawn. She'd heard screaming horses freeze still in their stalls. She'd lost her first daughter that winter, and no amount of hot stone beds or stacked quilts had saved her. She would not let that happen again, but no one here knew that. They only knew what they saw, a widow hauling rock, whispering to herself, sealing a dirt hole like a mad badger, ready for the grave. Even Pastor Lowell, the kindest man in the valley, tried to intervene. "You sure this is the best use of your strength, Clara?" he asked gently. One evening, just before dusk, she was shouldering logs, sweat streaked down her brow, skirts caked in red dust. "We've got timber to spare, you know. A proper chimney could still be put up before—" Clara didn't look at him. She didn't stop walking. "Wind don't care about chimneys, Reverend," she muttered, and kept on. By the second week of November, the crazy shelter was finished. It had no window, one entrance, a hatch made from old wagon boards, sealed tight with a roll of cloth dipped in beeswax. Inside were dried foods, a tiny barrel stove with a pipe barely wider than a milk bottle, and 3 bedrolls nested into the earth like fox kits in a den. It was not beautiful. It was not home. But it was safe, and no one laughed harder than when she moved her children into it the first time. "They're sleeping down there? In a hole? They'll catch fever before frost." But Clara didn't care, because the frost was coming. And that very night the wind shifted, the air thinned, the moon hung a little too sharp in the sky, and a strange stillness settled over the valley, like the breath before a scream. The first snow hit on November 20th. Most folks had just laid in their cords of wood. A few were still chinking holes in their walls. No one was ready. The snow didn't fall in soft flakes. It came like fists, driven sideways by wind that howled through every gap. It came with a low moan through the trees, stripping branches, ripping cloth from lines. By morning, drifts were chest high in some places, and it didn't stop. 3 days, 3 nights. Fires went out in chimneys too wide. Pipes cracked. Families wrapped themselves in wet blankets and listened to the wind scrape at their roofs like claws. On the 4th night, the frost pushed through walls, made ice inside mugs. And then the real cold came. The kind that made nails crack. The kind that left frostbite on children's ears before they could cry out. But in Clara's shelter, there was no wind, no frost on the bedrolls, just the soft crack of the tiny stove, the faint smell of moss insulation, and 2 children curled against their mother in a hole that no longer seemed crazy. Old Man Bain's roof blew clear off. The Thompsons' youngest got sick and didn't recover. 3 families had to be dug out after the wind froze their doors shut, but from Clara's dirt-covered shelter came no cries, no coughing. No smoke even, because the stove chimney was hidden behind a drift. Just silence, the silence of survival. And by the time the thaw came, when neighbors stumbled, blinking into pale sun and brittle air, it was the dirt mound they walked toward, not out of curiosity this time, out of awe. When Clara finally opened the hatch and climbed up with her 2 children, cheeks red, eyes bright, limbs strong, not a soul laughed, not even old Roger Bain. He just stared, then said quietly, "Well, I'll be damned," because the crazy shelter had worked, and in a valley full of broken cabins, it was the only thing that had. The valley never did speak of Clara Dorsey the same after that storm, where once they had whispered behind drawn curtains and fence rails. Now they watched her with a quiet weight behind the eyes, the look men wear when facing something they misjudged, a look reserved for preachers during funerals, or a mother when her child wakes from fever not dead but breathing. And Clara, who had endured the frost in the belly of the earth, returned to the thawed world neither proud nor broken, just awake. But the snow had only told part of the story, and what it left behind, splintered fences, hollow eyes, and too many empty cribs, made it clear the valley wasn't prepared, not for this winter, and maybe not for the next. For 3 days after the thaw, the air stayed dry and sharp as glass. It cut through sleeves, stiffened ropes, made axe blades feel brittle in the hand. Families tried to salvage what they could. Smoke returned to some chimneys, but others remained dark. Not out of choice, but from loss. One man, John McCrae, never emerged from his sod house at all. They found him curled around a frozen pipe, one hand still clenched like he meant to keep his fire alive with his fingers. Clara heard about it on the 4th morning, when little June came up from the shelter and found a neighbor girl, Maggie, age 9, shivering on the stump by their path. "She says her daddy's gone," June whispered. "She was knocking, but nobody came. Mama, she don't got any shoes." Clara didn't hesitate. She wrapped the girl's feet in burlap, soaked with lard, and brought her below. The shelter, now nicknamed the Hole, changed with each new visitor. What was once a cramped earthen bunker made for 3 now held 4, then 5. Maggie was the first. Then came Silas Lott, a wiry boy of 11 who'd dragged his little brother 2 miles through the drifts, both half frostbitten, both too afraid to speak of what happened in their cabin after the firewood ran out. Clara fed them in silence, lent them socks, pressed warm stones against their feet. They didn't ask questions, they didn't cry, they just stared at the muddy ceiling, eyes wide and glassy, waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing did, because Clara, for all the grief and madness folks had once painted her with, knew how to plan. She rotated the sleeping hours, rationed the food without looking hungry herself, boiled snow even when it stung her hands raw to fetch it. She kept the stove going with a precision more sacred than prayer. Every ember counted, every second of warmth was fought for, but the shelter wasn't magic. It was a coffin with a heartbeat, and Clara began to fear how long it would last. By the 6th day of snow, they were 9 people deep in that hole, 2 infants, 5 children, 1 woman, 1 man, a crippled trapper named Jed, who'd stumbled to the hatch one night with a leg like a rotted tree root and eyes blind from snowburn. He hadn't spoken much since, only muttered about the wind like it was a living thing. They let him lie near the stove. Clara, meanwhile, spent most days above ground now, braving the gusts for firewood and food. The trail to her cabin was barely wide enough for 1 person, and the snowdrifts pressed like walls on either side. She carved into them with a flat-bottomed pan when her shovel broke, scooping narrow walkways and throwing the snow onto her roof to insulate it further. She had one eye on survival. and the other on the town. Because what she saw in those quiet days, when the smoke didn't rise, when no children played, when the fields stood like white deserts full of ghosts, chilled her deeper than the cold ever could. On December 3rd, Clara reached the small trading post 3 miles south. She didn't bring the sled, just her boots, a hatchet, and a half-empty satchel. The wind was thinner that day, the sky the color of ash, and her tracks vanished behind her before she'd gone 100 yards. No one else walked, no dogs barked, just snow, silence, and the odd groan of trees under too much weight. At the post, she found the doors swung wide open. Inside, old Mr. Shale, the trader who kept ledger and lamp alike, lay on the floor, not dead, but near enough to it, lips cracked, fire out, inventory untouched. He hadn't even tried to light a candle. Clara didn't speak. She pulled him upright, poured a swig of whiskey between his teeth, and waited until he blinked twice and whispered, "I knew it. I knew you weren't crazy." That was all he said. Clara took what she could carry: salt, dried beans, a length of twine, one flint block, and 2 small tins of lamp oil. She left 3 buttons from her coat on the counter as payment. The way home took twice as long. Snow had hardened into crust, brittle on top, soft beneath, and every third step sank her to the knees. She cursed once, not at the snow, but at the sky, because she saw the clouds begin to roll again, and with them came a second storm, not as long, but crueler, the kind of storm that killed the weak just for being in the way. Clara ran the last half-mile. When she dropped into the shelter, cheeks blue, fingers shaking, her children tried to help her out of her coat. She waved them off. "We're not done yet," she muttered, and she was right, because that night the air changed again. It came like a scream across the ridges, the kind of wind that howled between your bones, not just your walls, the kind of cold that didn't just take warmth, it took hope. Firewood cracked like gunshots in the distance. Somewhere beyond the hills, someone was yelling, or praying, or both, and in the shelter the children began to shake. Little June, now huddled with Maggie and Silas's brother, looked up with eyes too big for her face. "Mama, what if it don't stop this time?" Clara didn't answer at first. She reached for the tin of lamp oil, lit a wick, set it low in the center of the shelter. A warm glow spreading just enough to make shadows dance. She knelt down beside the children, her voice steady but worn. "It'll stop. The storm always does. But we don't wait for it to stop. We beat it." She wasn't trying to be strong. She was telling herself the same thing. Through the next 2 days, Clara barely slept. She took turns at the stove, melting snow in the tin cup, checking the roof for signs of sag. She hung a rag over the vent pipe to prevent backdraft, reinforced the door hinge with a broken belt. She measured food by the spoonful. She fed the smallest children first, the older ones next. She herself did not eat more than a handful of beans and 1 square of lard-soaked cornbread in 36 hours. Still, the storm deepened, and on the 3rd night, the shelter roof began to groan. Not collapse, not creak, groan. Like the earth itself was being compressed under weight. Jed, the trapper, finally stirred to full awareness. "That's too much snow," he rasped. "She won't hold." Clara looked at him, then at the ceiling. Then she crawled to the hatch, opened it just a crack, and saw nothing but white, solid. 4 feet of snow sealed them in. The panic hit like a lightning bolt. The children stirred. One began to cry. The air inside was thick with breath, moisture slicking the walls. The stove, for the first time, began to waver. Clara didn't scream, but she stood. She walked to the wall, grabbed the flat-bottomed pan from its hook, and started scraping. Not wild, not desperate, methodical. Each stroke carved away the earth near the entry tunnel. She wasn't trying to dig up. She was widening the hatch space, letting cold air in. Yes, but preventing collapse, letting it breathe. Snow would crush a coffin, but not a den. "Silas," she called. The boy stepped forward. "Hold the lantern." He did, and together they worked. It took the rest of the night to reinforce the ceiling. They packed extra clay, laid in fresh bracing using 2 old broom handles and the trapper's walking stick. At one point the walls shivered. Everyone froze, but it held, and by dawn the pressure eased. The air lightened. The storm was breaking. Clara fell asleep with the pan still in her hands, sitting up against the wall, and when she woke, the hatch was glowing with pale gold light. The sun had come back. They'd made it. But Clara didn't smile, because the shelter might have saved them. But the rest of the valley, she didn't know, and something in her gut told her they'd be needed soon. Not for warmth, but for rescue, because the storm had taken more than it gave, and the dirt-roofed den wasn't just a sanctuary anymore. It was a lifeline, a secret worth sharing, or dying to keep. The 3rd storm had left more than a blanket of snow. It left questions, and Clara Dorsey had never been the kind of woman who let questions rest unanswered. By the time the hatch opened again and sunlight struck the packed earth walls of the shelter, Clara had already tied her boots and stood by the ladder. Her 2 children, June and little Sam, clung to her hem without a word. The others watched in silence. Silas, the wiry boy who'd become her second pair of hands, handed her the hatchet and nodded. He didn't ask what she planned to do. He already knew. Clara wasn't just going above for wood. She was going to find out who was left. The climb was harder than usual. The packed snow had iced over at the surface, forming a crust like glass. She had to crack through with her fists just to clear the hatch, then heave her body into a world of blinding brightness and ghostly stillness. Trees bent under the white, her chimney pipe barely poked through the drift. The storm had not just visited, it had moved in. Clara wrapped her scarf tight and started walking. It was 2 miles to the Anders place. She didn't make it 100 yards before she saw the first sign. Boot tracks. Not fresh, maybe a day old, but dragging. Someone had tried to walk this way during the storm. The steps were deep, uneven, veering off course in wide arcs, like a drunk or a man with frostbite. Then they stopped, just stopped, halfway through a drift. She found a mitten nearby, half buried in snow, too small for a man's hand. She didn't pick it up. The Anders cabin was still standing, but the roof had partially caved. The porch sagged under weight. There were no voices, no smoke. She approached cautiously, crunching through the snow with each heavy step. Her hatchet stayed in hand. The door was ajar. She pushed it inward. Inside, it was dark and dead. A pot lay overturned on the floor. The hearth was cold. A broken window let snow pile up against the far wall. And in the corner, near the cold stove, sat Marianne Anders. She wasn't dead, but she wasn't well. Wrapped in a quilt, her lips blue, eyes sunken. Beside her lay her son, barely 4, eyes closed. Clara dropped to her knees and checked his breath. Faint, but there. Marianne blinked once. "I couldn't get out," she whispered. "He wouldn't stop crying. Then he just stopped." Clara didn't ask questions. She pulled the quilt tighter around them both and said, "We're going underground." Dragging them back took 2 trips. First the boy, bundled and tied across Clara's back like firewood. Then the mother, supported by a sled she'd dug free from under a drift. It was brutal work. The wind was gone, but the cold remained like teeth in her lungs. Twice she fell. Once she bit her tongue so hard blood dripped onto the snow. But by dusk, both were inside the shelter, and the others had made room. No one complained. No one even sighed. The silence that followed wasn't discomfort. It was respect. That night, Clara didn't sleep. Instead, she kept the fire alive and scribbled marks into the shelter wall with a piece of charcoal, tallying the days since the first snow, the number of people below, how many mouths still needed feeding. They were 10 now, 10 lives packed into a hole never meant for more than 3. And still, Clara knew, more would come. The storm hadn't broken the valley, not entirely, but it had cracked the surface, and underneath, people were starving. The next morning, she found the boy with the frostbitten toes. He didn't knock, he didn't even call. He just sat by the hatch with his boots off, toes blackened, eyes blank. He'd come from the Weller farm, nearly 3 miles north. "They're gone," he whispered when Clara reached him. "All of 'em. Papa first, then Mama, then Ruth. I waited too long." His name was Eli, 9 years old, carried nothing but a pocket knife and a biscuit so hard it snapped in half when she tried to bite it. Clara brought him below, wrapped his feet in cloth soaked with rendered fat, held his hand when the pain made him clench his jaw so tight a tooth cracked. And still, she didn't cry. She didn't cry because her mind had already moved beyond the pain. It was moving ahead, calculating, planning, adapting. This wasn't survival anymore. It was warfare. It was Jed, the old trapper, who spoke first the next evening. "You need help, widow," he said, voice like gravel. "You can't hold all this yourself." Clara didn't argue. Instead, she looked at Silas. "Tomorrow," she said, "we scout." And so they did. Clara and Silas left at dawn, armed with 2 hatchets, 1 broken rifle with a single round and a coil of rope. Their boots were wrapped in oilcloth to keep the damp out. Clara had stitched a pair of crude snow glasses from willow slats to protect against glare. The snow had begun to soften at the top, but it was treacherous. 1 misstep, and a leg would sink up to the thigh. They didn't speak much as they moved, just nodded when a sound caught the wind or a footprint looked fresh. They visited the Howell place first, found the barn torn open, 2 goats frozen stiff inside, their breath long since stilled. The main cabin had collapsed under snow, no bodies. Clara left a mark in the snow with a looped twig, a signal for no life, no danger, no food. At the Miller homestead, they found the opposite, a woman alone, wrapped in rags, burning pages from her family Bible to keep the stove lit. Her eyes lit up when Clara walked in. Then she saw the boy, and she began to cry. That day, Clara and Silas brought back 2 more souls. By the end of the week, the shelter held 14 people. It had become a hive of breath and warmth, of rot and hope. There were smells that never left: smoke, sweat, blood, mold. The youngest children no longer cried at night. They were too tired, too cold, or too resigned. Clara kept her mind sharp by carving a map into the shelter wall, marking the homes they'd visited, the ones lost, the ones silent, and she started to realize this wasn't just a crisis, it was a collapse. The valley's families had spent decades fighting nature on its terms. Clara had done something different. She'd outthought it. One night, as snow whispered against the vent pipe, and the oil lantern dimmed to a flicker, Maggie, the girl who'd come barefoot weeks ago, spoke. "Miss Clara," she asked, "do you think it's always going to be like this?" Clara didn't answer right away. She watched the children curled beside the stove, the women stitching rags into blankets, Jed muttering over a piece of kindling he was trying to shape into a spoon. And then she said, "No." But she didn't say it like a promise. She said it like a warning, because something was changing. Not just the weather, but the people. In mid-December, someone broke into the trading post. Clara had visited just 3 days prior and left more buttons in exchange for dried peas and a length of canvas. But on her next trip, the place was ransacked, shelves overturned, oil gone, lockbox smashed, and near the back wall, in the ash of the old stove, she found footprints, fresh, boots, adult-sized, drag marks, and blood. No body, no note, just a crude mark carved into the doorframe. Clara stared at it for a long time. Then she left the shelter that night with the rifle and didn't return until dawn. She said nothing about what she found, but after that day, she kept the hatch barred from the inside and taught the children how to use the broken rifle stock as a club. They weren't alone anymore, not really. The storm had scattered the valley's people like seeds in the wind. Some buried, some still growing, but a few had turned feral, and Clara knew enough of men to understand what starvation could do. The shelter had become more than a haven. It was now the only target left, so she changed it. The air vent was extended using tin stovepipe, buried beneath a false snowdrift 50 feet uphill. The chimney was capped with brush when not in use. The hatch was camouflaged with slats of bark, rope, and ash. One of the older boys, 12-year-old Eli, began standing watch in shifts, perched just under the hatch with a length of sharpened steel from a wagon wheel, spoke, and Clara trained them, not to fight, to survive. Silence became habit, movement became planned, every cough was muffled, every footstep placed like it mattered. The shelter had become a living body, and Clara was its heart. On the night of December 19th, a sound woke them all. Footsteps. Above. Close. Too close. Clara didn't breathe. The children froze. Then, a voice. A man's. Rough. Hoarse. "You got firewood, lady?" Silence. "You got anything?" A second voice now. "Don't got a killer. Just take what's warm." The hatch creaked. Eli gripped the sharpened spoke, but Clara placed a hand on his wrist. And then, with slow precision, she turned the oil lamp down low. The shelter vanished into pitch-black silence. Above, the voices grumbled, then faded. Minutes passed, then an hour, no movement. At last, Clara let out the breath she'd held. The shelter was safe, for now, but the valley was turning wild, and she knew, with an ache in her bones and a thrum in her chest, this wasn't the last knock they'd hear. By Christmas Eve, the valley was unrecognizable. No bells rang, no chimneys smoked in chorus. The snow hadn't melted. It had calcified, hardened into a pale crust that reflected the sun like mirrors. The trees no longer swayed in the wind. They stood petrified in frost, their limbs broken and bark stripped by relentless gales. And beneath it all, under that crust of silence, starvation, and fear, the only sound left in the valley came from the ground itself. From below, inside the shelter, the air was warmer than outside, but no longer felt safe. What had once been a den of survivors had grown into something else, a last refuge for a dying town. 18 people now slept in shifts. Children took turns standing guard beside the hatch. Clara rationed food like a general directing a siege. The walls were lined with bundled roots, scavenged herbs, and boxes of snow used to keep perishables cool. The trapper Jed carved little pegs into the mud to track days, his scrawl bending more crooked each time, and still more came. The widow Monroe arrived just after midnight on the 22nd, dragging a sled with her deaf brother tied to it by a fraying rope. Her hands were raw to the bone. She had no coat. She collapsed by the hatch and didn't even knock, just whispered, "Please," until someone heard her. Her face was sunburned from snow glare, and her feet were wrapped in torn flour sacks. Her brother never woke up. They buried him in the snow beside the collapsed well, marking the spot with a tin spoon nailed to a splinter of pine. No one cried. There weren't enough tears left. Clara had stopped sleeping, not in a dramatic way, not in martyrdom. It just left her. Her body moved like muscle memory, as if her bones knew the chores by name. Her eyes would close for minutes at a time, never more. Her mouth cracked from thirst she didn't feel. Her hair hung in a permanent twist of damp sweat and soot. When her daughter June asked, "Mama, when do we go back to the house?" Clara just stared. The house was buried. The roof had caved. The door had vanished beneath a drift so thick it groaned when wind struck it. There was no going back. The shelter wasn't a backup plan anymore. It was home. The knock came on Christmas morning. Not a voice, not a threat. A single knock. Soft, measured, the kind of knock a preacher gives before delivering bad news. Clara was at the stove, stirring snow and dried beans in a tin cup. When the hatch vibrated, the children froze. Jed reached for his stick. Maggie covered the infants with a quilt. Clara climbed the ladder herself. She lifted the edge of the hatch just enough to see, and for a moment she didn't understand what she was looking at. A girl, maybe 12, wrapped in furs, her eyes hidden behind cracked snow goggles. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shaking, just standing there. Behind her, a second figure, a boy, much younger, wrapped in what looked like stitched-together rabbit pelts. Neither spoke, but they weren't alone. Behind them, stretching back into the white like the tail of a retreating army, were people, dozens, families, children, a crippled man in a wheelbarrow, a woman leaning on a pitchfork, a teenager dragging a sack of kindling like a body, faces burned red from cold, hands bleeding from splinters, all of them wordless, all walking toward the shelter. Clara opened the hatch fully. She didn't invite them in. She led them in. The shelter could not hold them all. It was never meant to, and Clara knew it, so she changed the rules. For the first time, she opened the cabin again, her ruined cabin, buried halfway beneath snow. Roof sagged, hearth cracked. It was a dead structure, but with bodies inside it, with quilts nailed over the holes, and people packed in like a chorus of breath and flesh, it lived again. They used the cabin for the sick. The shelter remained the fire heart. They moved in shifts, 8 in rotation, built benches from crates, and hammered a crude path through the snow using shovels made from fence planks. The men who could still swing tools became scavengers. The older boys carved out trenches between the shelter and cabin so you could walk through snow walls 6 feet tall like a maze. A few girls began weaving mittens from rope fibers, their fingers bandaged and bleeding. It wasn't a town, but it was a tribe. And Clara Dorsey sat in the center like a stone in the storm. On December 27th, a body was found in the snow. A man, unknown, half frozen, rope burns on his wrists, a broken lantern tied to his belt. His eyes were open, mouth slack. In his hand, a crude map drawn on hide, marked with exiles. The shelter was one of them. He had never knocked. Clara buried him without asking who he was, because she already knew what he meant. By New Year's Eve, 37 people lived around the shelter. No one kept track of how many had come through. Some stayed only a night, long enough to eat, warm, and weep. Others arrived in silence and never left. One child, unnamed, never spoken to, simply curled up in the trench beside the stove and didn't move for 3 days. Then one morning he stood. He helped Clara carry water, and she didn't ask where he came from. Some stories didn't need names, but trouble was coming. Not from nature, from men. Clara had seen it in the eyes of a boy who arrived with a bullet wound in his leg. He said he'd been chased. He said there were others, 4 of them, with weapons. Real rifles, not trapper junk. They'd come down from the ridgeline, following heat, smoke, survival. "They're not looking for shelter," the boy said. "They're looking for control." They'd taken over the Mitchell homestead, he claimed, demanded food, demanded women. "They asked if I knew where people were hiding." He didn't tell them. He ran, and they shot him. Clara patched his leg, then went to the map carved into her wall. She scratched a deep gouge through the Mitchell place, then drew a wide, sweeping line around her own. Not a wall, a border. She gathered the strongest, 5 men, 3 women, and told them the truth. This wasn't a game anymore. This wasn't winter. This was war. They armed themselves with what they had. Axes, fence posts, a rusted revolver with 2 bullets, a sharpened pitchfork. The children were trained to stay below. The hatch was reinforced with chain. The cabin chimney was rigged to collapse in case of siege, Clara's idea. "If we can't keep the heat," she said, "we don't let them take it." On January the 2nd, they came, 3 figures at first, one waving a red scrap of cloth, not a surrender flag, a signal. They stood at the edge of the tree line, rifles slung over their shoulders, mouths hidden by scarves. Clara stood outside the hatch, fire axe in hand. She didn't wait, she walked to them. "You're guarding something," one man said, voice dry and cracked like bark. "We just want to trade." Clara looked at his boots, dry, untouched by snow. "You didn't walk here," he grinned. "You're smart." She didn't reply, just raised the axe, not to swing, but to show she could. "You'll get nothing," she said. The man shrugged, then spat. "We'll come back." Clara's grip tightened. "No, You won't. That night she posted guards in the trees. Silas, Jed, Eli, the trapper with one eye, a girl named Ruth with arms like ropes. They didn't sleep, they waited. And when the men did come back, 2 nights later, in the snow-blind dark, they were met not with bullets, but silence. Every trench was empty, every shelter hidden. They searched the cabin, found it bare. Then one climbed the ridge and found himself looking down the chimney pipe, staring into a fire still burning. He turned, too late. Clara was behind him. She didn't swing the axe, she just knocked the pipe. The ash dropped, the smoke blew back, and in the time it took him to scream, the trench had filled with people. Not soldiers, survivors. They left after that. What few of them could still walk. They didn't return, and the shelter remained. But Clara knew the end was near, not because help was coming, because winter was breaking. The sun stayed up longer, the snow crust softened, birds returned, and people began to talk about spring like it was a dream waking up. They didn't cheer, they didn't cry, they just began to live. Ropes were unwound, quilts cleaned, stale bread baked into ash cakes. Children walked without shaking, firewood lasted longer. The map on the wall no longer needed X's, because the worst was behind them. And one day, as the wind howled softly and the trees creaked not from cold but from weight, Clara stepped out of the shelter and looked at the valley. She saw smoke from new chimneys, laughter from the trench, children building sleds from crates, and in the distance, where her cabin had once stood proud, and now sagged like a dying lung, she saw people working, not for her, with her. The shelter had saved them, but the woman who built it, she'd rebuilt the town. The last snow melted slower than expected, even in March, long after the sun had begun to stretch its arms across the ridge and shadows had softened. The drifts clung to the base of trees like old memories. The trenches between the cabin and the shelter began to collapse in on themselves, not from snow, but from use. Boots had worn them smooth. Children ran them daily, no longer as survival corridors, now as paths between what had been terror and what had become home. The shelter that once resembled a grave now echoed with footsteps, voices, and the sounds of hammers striking repaired beams. Above it, the battered cabin groaned as new rafters were lifted by joint effort. Wood was no longer hoarded, fire no longer rationed. The valley, once paralyzed by wind and hunger, began to stir, and Clara Dorsey, for the first time in months, stood in daylight with nothing in her hands. No axe, no satchel, no rope or kettle or scraped tin pan, just her daughter June's hand, and her son Sam's laughter on the wind. They held a meeting on March 12th, not in a church. The church was gone. Not in the schoolhouse. It too had collapsed under snow. They met in the clearing beside Clara's shelter, just east of the rebuilt trench, where firewood was stacked high in 2 crisscrossed towers like a tribute to old gods. There were 43 people by then, some from the valley, some from beyond. All had the same face, worn, cautious, alive. Jed the trapper sat propped on a crate, his leg now wrapped in fresh linen, his voice raspy but loud. Ruth, the girl with arms like braided hickory, stood with her sleeves rolled and a sore at her hip. Eli and Silas had taken to carrying tools even when they weren't working, habits born in hunger. Clara didn't speak first. It was Pastor Lowell who did. He'd arrived just days prior, gaunt and hoarse, having survived off tree bark and melted snow in the West Range after his chapel roof caved. He stood with one hand over his heart, the other holding his ruined Bible. "I didn't believe it," he said. "I didn't believe she was right. When she dug that hole, I thought we'd be burying her come spring." He looked at Clara. She built it for her children, but she saved all of us. There were no cheers, no applause, just nods, because every person there carried a scar shaped like silence. And in that silence, Clara finally spoke. "I didn't build that shelter to prove anything," she said. "I built it because I'd seen what the cold does when it gets teeth. I'd seen how the world don't care how young your child is or how many prayers you say." She paused. "I wasn't trying to lead no one. I just refused to dig another grave for someone I loved." The crowd didn't stir, but their stillness was louder than wind. Clara nodded toward the new posts being raised behind them. "If this valley's got a future, it'll be because we stopped laughing at the ones who build strange, the ones who do what ain't normal. Because I've learned something." She turned toward her shelter, a mound of earth and stone now ringed with footprints, children's toys, and a fire pit. "Sometimes, the only sane thing in a crazy world is a shelter no one understands. Until it saves you." The days that followed blurred together in rhythm, work, sleep, laughter. For the first time since Dale, Her husband had died. Clara laughed without guilt. Her laughter was small, but it came from deep. She watched Sam roll in the wet grass, and June help younger children build a windbreak of woven sticks. She let the boys paint crude murals on the interior walls of the shelter, and let the girls braid twine into patterns no one remembered learning but everyone seemed to know. Food was still hard to come by, but no one starved. Scavenging became organized. Hunters left in teams and returned with rabbits, sometimes a deer. The valley's animals, too, were thawing out, returning with cautious hunger. Snowmelt filled dry creeks. The trees creaked and cracked under new weight, life. And every person, everyone, now had a role, because Clara had made it clear. If you want warmth, you carry wood. If you want food, you stir the pot. If you want to sleep beneath a roof, you help hold it up. It wasn't tyranny, it was family. One day in April, a rider came from the west, not from the valley, from town, the real town, the rail-lined place with stagecoaches and telegraph wires. He came riding a tired gelding, coat torn, hat tilted sideways. His horse was gaunt, ribs showing, but he had a satchel full of letters. He came to check for survivors. He didn't expect what he found. 40-some people in the middle of nowhere. A woman with soot-streaked cheeks organizing firewood collection like a sergeant. Children learning to plant small plots using ash and compost. Men reforging tools from wagon scraps. And at the center, a hole in the ground covered in packed earth and rock. He dismounted, blinked, then asked, "Who's in charge here?" Everyone pointed to Clara. The man, a federal courier, had been sent to document settlements lost during the freeze. His notebook already contained 17 names with a red X next to each one. Whole towns gone, entire families vanished. He asked Clara how they survived. She didn't speak. She showed him, took him below, let him walk the shelter. By lantern light, he saw what they'd lived through. Soot-stained walls, smoothed from so many hands, ropes hung like veins, crude shelves, spoons carved from old timber, a mural drawn by children. Wild animals curled beside sleeping children, smoke-stained handprints pressed against the clay. He wrote down one word, shelter. He asked what she called it. She said nothing. But when he tried to leave, the youngest boy, the one without a name, ran up and said, "She saved us here," and pointed to the dirt. The courier just nodded and didn't ask again. News traveled as it always does, first in letters, then in person. By summer, people came to see it, not for rescue, for learning, carpenters, surveyors, families with tools and no trust in city walls. They came and asked, "Is it true? You lived through the freeze in a hole?" And Clara, standing barefoot by the fire pit, would shrug. "Not a hole," she'd say. "A womb." That's how one reporter described it in the town paper. The Dorsey womb. It made Clara laugh, but she didn't correct them. Because maybe they were right. Maybe this whole place had been a kind of womb. Dark, warm, confining, full of cries and blood and breath. And when the storm passed, they had been born again. Later that fall, when the ground had hardened again and new homes were rising, Clara walked with her daughter past the shelter. June was taller now, freckled, her hair in a braid tied with twine. "Mama," she said, "why didn't the other folks build shelters like ours?" Clara thought. "I think some folks think storms ain't real until they're inside one," she said. "They think the world will stay soft just because it was soft yesterday." June looked at the ground. "Will it happen again?" Clara looked at the sky. Pale blue, wide, endless. "Maybe," she said, "but not the same way." They stood in silence. Then June asked, "Would you build another?" Clara smiled. "No," she said. "Next time you will." And they walked on. In the years that followed, the story of the shelter spread. Some embellished, some forgot names. But the truth, the bone truth of it, endured. That one woman, mocked and whispered about, built something out of desperation that would go on to save not just her blood, but a people. And the next generation grew up not laughing at strange builders, but becoming them.